Hi, welcome to BF5, Understanding and Working with Young People. There are 6 parts to Boarding Fundamentals, and this is part 5. The first section is about youth, and we might also refer to youth as an adolescent, a teenager, a young person. It's this time of life between childhood and adulthood. The United Nations define youth as 15 to 25 years of age. Youth didn't exist, the concept of youth didn't exist before the 1940s. It was created by television marketing people so that they could market to what became quite a separate culture. As young people move into this phase of their lives, they go through puberty. Puberty is a physical change when a child's body matures into an adult body capable of sexual reproduction. And for girls, this begins about 10 to 11 years old and ends about 15 to 17 years old. For boys, it begins about 11 to 12 years old, about a year later, and then ends a year later, 16 to 17-year-olds. The start and end times vary across different cultures. It is occurring earlier for girls and boys, of course, but earlier for both, really. And this is because of social and nutritional factors. Young people have certain characteristics as they're going through this phase of their lives, and one, of course, is very fast physical development. They grow up fast. They're forming their identity, working out who they are. There's increasing independence, emotional maturing, their brain is restructuring, and they're preparing for adulthood. And this is the answer to question 1. I'd like to show you a clip from Puberty Blues, and the reason I'd like to do this is that I just feel that life for Australian young people and for young people, I guess, in many different countries in the 1960s and the 1970s was a lot simpler, a lot more innocent, a lot more carefree than what young people have to cope with today. And so I'd just like to show you a little clip. And so that was the life of young people in Australia in the 1970s, and that film was made in 1980. And I'd like to show you another film. This was made just a couple of years ago. It's called Wasted on the Young, and in this movie we see all of the current themes, all of the things that young people are facing today. You know, the depression, anxiety, the use of social media to bully, suicide. All of those themes are a part of this movie. The first kind is the second kind is really scary. And so that's just a little bit of that movie, Wasted on the Young. And so as we're thinking about young people and as you work with young people, I guess we need to be aware that their lives are complex. They have lots of issues and lots of things to deal with that we probably didn't have to deal with as we were growing up. Talking about as we were growing up, so let's have a look at the generations. These are the different generations: the silent generation, the baby boomers. So my father was the silent generation, my mum and dad. I'm a baby boomer. And then you have Generation X, 1960s to the 1980s, Generation Y, 1980s to the early 2000s, and then Generation Z, early 2000s to the present day. And so all of the young people that we will be dealing with in schools will pretty much all be Generation Z. So this is question 2. What are 3 characteristics of Generation Z? Generation Z are more positive about diversity, different cultures, etc. They're very highly connected digitally. Many have got both parents working. They may earn less than their parents. There's often blurred gender roles, and it's a pluralistic lifestyle. It's a diversity of religious, cultural beliefs and values. It's very pluralistic. So let's have a look at the developmental stages, and this is some of the stages. You can see there's nothing before early childhood and there's nothing after early adulthood. I just haven't put those stages in. So we've got early childhood 5 to 8, middle childhood 9 to 11, early adolescence 12 to 15, 12 to 14, middle adolescence 15 to 18, and early adulthood 19 to 40. And different sociologists, different commentators have slightly different views on this, but this is generally what people accept. When we look at these developmental stages, we see that age is not a predictor of maturity. Some people are quite mature when they're young, and others can be older and still not that mature. Most follow a predictable order. Age at a stage varies enormously. They may develop at different rates in different areas. So when we're looking at the developmental stages, you'll see on Appendix 4, it goes through the developmental stages like this, and talks about characteristics of those developmental stages. And so this assessment question is asking you this is 3 part B, select 3 characteristics that you think are significant in boarding for one of the developmental stages. So we're just looking at this one here, early adolescence, for instance, and concerned about physical development, being liked by friends, social graces, have intense feelings related to sex, keen interest in their own body, they desire independence, but still yet want and need their parents' help. They're beginning to question authority and the values of parents. Now, all of these are characteristics of that particular stage. And so if you can have a look at that, this is middle adolescence, and if you can just have a look and just see some of those that are, very obvious or very evident in the young people who are in your boarding context. All right, universal needs. And so all young people need to experience success, self-esteem, this is for self-esteem, increase their own independence, develop and accept sexual identity, give and receive attention, experience adventure, and be accepted by different ages, peers, as well as older people. And this is interesting, isn't it? Because I guess this is where we come in. We might be one of those people who are important in their lives, and that is part of their need. It's one of the universal needs. And so that is question 4. So what do we do to meet universal needs? We provide a choice of activities that are at different levels of difficulty, so that we're catering for the different maturities and different development of young people. And then some may need more experiences to catch up to others. So if we can provide those experiences as part of what we're doing in boarding. Let's have a look at the adolescent brain. When a child is 6 years old, their brain is 90 to 95% of adult size. During adolescence, there's significant growth and development. Any unused neural pathways are pruned away, and necessary and important pathways are strengthened. The prefrontal cortex, the part that we use to rationalise, is the last to mature, and that's problematic for some young people. So if we look at the world youth population, we find that 85% live in developing countries, and in about 10 or 15 years, that will be 90% of young people will be living in developing countries. And 60% of these live in Asia, and 20% of them experience a major issue. And this is the answer to question 5. What is that issue? That issue is a mental health problem in a year. And the way we define that is that we say that they have taken a week off work or school, and that they've actually been to see a doctor or another professional about this mental health problem. So that's a very significant number of young people who are experiencing mental health problems. So Australia's young people, they're 20% of Australia's population, which really means that we are ageing. Um, we're an ageing society. Um, Mostly the young people in Australia are healthy, happy, productive, um, but male and female teenagers 15 to 19 years old have the highest hospitalisation rates for acute intoxication from alcohol amongst all age groups. Not all young people are on the same footing. Some have serious disadvantage and are at risk of social exclusion, and some of those would include Indigenous young people, those not engaged in education or work, young people with a disability, those living in low socioeconomic households. If we look at a group of 100 Australian young people, 66 of them live at home with two parents, 20 live with one parent, 3.6 of them are Indigenous, 20 were born overseas, 6.6 in Asia and 2.6 in Europe. 20 speak a language other than English at home, 10 speak an Asian language, 4 speak another European language. In this group of 100 Australian young people, 1 is homeless, 63 are in some form of education, 43 are in secondary school, 20 in tertiary and 6 in vocational. 50% of Indigenous young people are enrolled in education in this 15 to 19-year-old group. 76% of non-Indigenous young people are enrolled in education. So it's a very big disparity there. 14% of Indigenous adults in post-secondary education, 20 to 24 years old. 35% of non-Indigenous adults in post-secondary education. So this is an issue. It's a big issue for Australia to resolve this disparity. When we're looking at employment, 14% are out of work, and the average across Australia, 20% in some regions, 1% are long-term unemployed, 20% change their labour force status every month. So that means that they go from working to study or study to being unemployed or something like that. Mobility in the youth market is very high. Stability of full-time employment is declining. Full-time employment is just not available for many young people, especially stable long-term full-time employment. 66 out of 100 acknowledge a religious affiliation, 58 Christian, and then the next largest group is Islam. 23 indicated they had no religion at all. The remaining 13 did not specify any. When we're looking at our health, 5 are overweight or obese, 26 have a mental disorder, 5 smoke at least weekly, and that's a pretty low rate. 16 males drink at levels which place them at risk. 10.5 females do the same. Suicide's the leading cause of death. 20% of 16-year-olds had used illicit drugs. 30% of young people try cannabis for the first time before they are 15. So if we look at burden of disease, I'm not sure if you've come across this term, but burden of disease is like, what is the total cost of a disease or an illness or a sickness to a society? And when we're trying to work that sort of thing out, we're looking at the dollar cost, but also the fact that these people are not gainfully employed, that because they're homesick, that sort of thing. So there's the list, and the question 7 asks which is the highest. And so for males, it's anxiety and depression, and there's the list of the order, burden of disease. For females, it's anxiety and depression as well. And so, and you can see the list of different factors for burden of disease. All right, so the next question, question 8, says, what is the relationship between Australian young people and social media? And you can just write in whatever, put in your own words, I guess, what you think is the relationship. We know that they have a very strong very strong connection with social media, don't we? There's some statistics. Every time we change these statistics, we have to change them again and then again because they are changing so fast. Just in Australia, there's 16 million users of Facebook, and 14 million of YouTube, and so on and so forth. So a high number of users for these social media platforms. So young people have got a very strong connection with social media. They prefer smartphones, and they're very connected or attached to their phones and to media. When we look at crime, about 12,000 young people are under juvenile justice supervision in Australia. 650 are in detention centres, which is very low. It's a very small number of, when you work it out, we've got 6 states, a couple of territories. You start dividing 650 amongst those, and we don't have very many young people in detention. Youth commit 22% of all offences, but they're only 14% of the population. So they're committing a lot more offences for their age group than the rest of the population. All right, so let's look at youth culture. Youth culture is very diverse, and it looks very different depending on who is describing it. It's very complex, and it's continually evolving. It's evolved a lot recently. The use of social media and the internet has changed youth culture. Culture is the way people conduct their lives, and it includes things like interests, styles, behaviours, music, beliefs, vocabulary, clothes, sports, dating, all of those sort of things. Sometimes residential supervisors are actually quite close to the age of the students. And one of the good things about that, of course, is that they will have probably a better understanding of the issues which are impacting young people. They will understand the culture and all the implications of the culture, but they do need to watch the boundaries. And it is probably more difficult for young people that are close to the age of the people that they're looking after. For older residential supervisors, they understand. They need to understand and bridge that age culture gap. So there's going to be an age culture gap between them and the young people they're looking after, and they need to bridge that. They need to understand why that gap is there, what the gap looks like, and then bridge it. Why do they need to do that? They need to do it to keep in touch with current youth culture and characteristics, to have that empathy and connection, just to be able to connect with young people, to be more alert to the issues, and all of this, of course, is to be able to support them better. Subcultures, these are social groups with patterns of behaviour that distinguish it from the rest of the youth culture. So, and you'll see some youth subcultures there. They're different from the general youth cultures. The norms, values and behaviours vary very widely. They're constantly changing, but it is an avenue of self-expression, and sometimes these youth subcultures can be hostile to the dominant culture or to countercultures. So subcultures are distinguished by fashion, beliefs, slang, behaviour, vehicles, cars, motorcycles, scooters, skateboards, music genres, socio-economic class, gender, intelligence and ethnic background. And you can see some of the Australian city subculture groups. So this is what you would be likely to find in an Australian city. Emo, super geek, jock dolly, gangster, punk light, glamazon, hipster, techno boho and techno bobo. The lads, surfies, skaters, hall girls, sea punks and gym bros. And you... when you go through that, you'll recognise some of those. Others you've probably got no idea what they are, but look them up later. It's interesting to look them up. So for a lot of you who are listening to this, you're going to have young people in your boarding residences who are part of these subculture groups. So they'll belong to one of these subculture groups. And question 10 says, if a student becomes involved in a subculture group such as emo, if they're an emo, What approach should the supervisor take? So that's question 10. So the supervisor should do this. They should learn about what an emo actually is. They should take an interest, ask, hear the story from the young person. They should respect their right to individuality, and respect the choices they've made. But you have to intervene if their choices are harmful to them or harmful to others, or if their choices break the school rules or break the boarding residence rules. And so that young lady with the blue hair, that blue hair may not be acceptable in all boarding residences. Okay, so let's move on and look at youth-centred practices. So this is practices from boarding supervisors, from people involved in working with young people, youth-centred practice. What does it mean? It means that young people are the main focus. They engage with young people, they provide opportunity for young people, they empower young people. That is what youth-centred practice is. When we apply it, we come up with these sort of things. We understand the factors that influence young people. We're sensitive to the special needs of young people. We respect the identities, culture and diversity of young people, understand developmental issues. We're informed about issues and interests. We're aware of rights and responsibilities. We include young people in decision making. We empower young people. We have confidentiality and duty of care. We observe boundaries in our role. We have a comfortable, user-friendly environment, and we use sensitive, innovative approaches to dealing with issues. So the question 12 asks you just to list 5 of these that you see as most important. Okay, the next section is about interaction with young people, how we interact with them. It's really important that our interaction is effective, really needs to be effective, our communication and interaction. It should be caring and positive, non-judgmental, fair and inclusive, and we should have a genuine interest. We should be able to connect with and listen to, communicate with young people. It's interesting that our own journey, our own beliefs, our own values, opinions, biases, that will affect how we listen to young people. And we will listen differently because of our values, opinions, biases, etc. So it's helpful to self-reflect, to understand who we are, understand how that affects our ability to listen, and that helps us to stay impartial or non-judgmental. So that's self-reflection, just having a clear understanding of our biases, our values, our strengths, and then how that affects our ability to listen. So there are different types of listening: appreciative listening, and that's like listening to music, poetry; critical listening might be listening to an essay or something like that; empathetic listening, and that's what we want to talk about in a moment. That is the sort of listening that you will be doing with the young people that you're working with. And discriminative listening, that's listening to material like this. Empathetic listening. So this is paying attention to the young person and to their emotion, to their journey, to their story, hearing and understanding them, trying to walk in their experience, and just this approach improves understanding, and it improves trust between the young person and the boarding supervisor. So when we look at effective listening, it's important that we give undivided attention, that we are, so you can't multitask when you're trying to listen to a young person. You can't be looking at texts on your phone or whatever and listening to them at the same time. We need to give undivided attention. We need to be non-judgmental. We need to be aware that we don't need to give an instant reply to everything. We can there can be quiet, need to respond to their emotions. Sometimes we'll need to clarify what they've said so we can be sure that we understand what they've said, and to be approachable, don't overreact. So all of that's a part of effective listening and part of the answer to question 16. So strategies for effective communication are clear, consistent messages. Be positive, model positive, don't continually criticise, avoid power struggles, use the media to bring up topics and focus on their interest. So these are strategies for effective communication. Avoid talking too much. Young people prefer face-to-face or technology-based communication, not written. Communicate at their level. Use the backdoor approach. Now, what we mean by that is sometimes if you are having difficulty with communicating with a student, you might use a roundabout approach. So you might communicate with one of their friends who then communicates that to them, so that you still have that way of communicating with them. It's always important to give young people notice. So if you're going to be doing something, if there's a change or something like that, to make sure that they've got notice. Give them advance warning. So we can use communication to build trust. So how do we do that? We ensure that we keep confidences. So if they're telling us something, then we keep it confidential, except, of course, if it's a mandatory reporting thing, except if it's possible that they're it will cause harm to themselves or harm to another person. Keep our word. Never lie to young people. Admit your mistakes, and if we've made a mistake, apologise. Share our experiences in a limited way. So this doesn't mean share all your personal baggage, I guess, but it means they might be telling you, some story about what happened to them and, the terrible trauma of this thing that's happened to them. And you might say, well, look, that happened to me when I was younger as well, and this is how I dealt with it, and so share experiences like that. Good, so let's move on to rapport. And this is such an important part of this, isn't it? It's essential that we have rapport with young people, the young people that we're working with. Rapport is that friendly engagement or connection. It's an interest, a trust, a shared concern, that sort of thing. It's very important that we're not over familiar or that we're not too harsh or distant. So if you think of a pendulum, and the correct balance with rapport is when the pendulum hangs straight down. If it's hanging up one way, then it's when we're harsh and we're distant, judgmental. And if it's the other way, it's when we're too familiar with them. And we talked earlier on about having that gap, that small gap between you and the student, which is part of a professional relationship. So it's a bit like this. Rapport is on a continuum between being distant and uncaring and over-familiar or informal. So what happens if you are over-familiar? If you are over-familiar, and I don't think it's quite like this picture depicts, it's more when you are, very over-friendly, over-sharing, over-chatty, that sort of thing. And if you are over-familiar, students can tend to lose respect. They can tend not to follow instructions. They might just say, no, I'm not doing that, because you have that sort of relationship with them. They take liberties. It can look like an unprofessional relationship to outsiders, and it can also look like favouritism to students, to other students. So if we are over familiar, how do we restore the balance? The first thing is that we don't punish the child. It's our fault. It's not their fault. And sometimes you'll have to admit to a young person that you have been over familiar. So you might say to them, look, I've been a bit too casual, I've been a bit too free and easy, so this is something I need to fix up. So I'm going to be a little bit different. So, but don't worry about that. It's something I just need to fix. So admit it to the young person, and then reinforce the professional distance between you. And for a while, that is going to swing the other way. The pendulum will swing the other way, away from being over familiar. So I hope that makes sense. It's a very important part of what we do, and it's important that we get it right. And it's hard to get it exactly right. So let's talk about cross-cultural issues, working with cross-cultural young people. Students might experience, this is students from a cross-cultural context, language barriers, expectations are hard to understand. There's discrimination, there could be past traumas, dislocation or disconnection, negative economic and health outcomes, and poor access to health services. So they're the sort of things that students may experience if they're from a cross-cultural context. So how do we support them? We value the diversity, so I think we, in Australia now, we really do value the diversities that has come into this country over the years. We're such a diverse culture, and we're becoming more diverse, and that brings colour and interest to our lives, and so we should value the diversity that people from other cultures, young people from other cultures, bring to your boarding residence. We should use cross-cultural brokers, so they are people who are familiar and comfortable in the other culture. So it might actually be a person from that culture, or it might be a person who's not from the culture but still familiar and comfortable in there. Get awareness training so that we are aware of correct ways to support young people. And if there is discrimination, if you come across discrimination against young people who are culturally diverse in your boarding residence, it needs to be dealt with immediately and dealt with very effectively. Question 21 asks you to provide a YouTube clip to promote respect for other cultures. So if you can go onto YouTube and search for a clip, there's lots of really good clips in there about other cultures, valuing other cultures, getting on together, and all of that sort of thing. So if you can find one and put it on there, then that would be good for question 21. There's a couple that we like. One is called I Like Football, or Celebrating Cultural Diversity in Football. There's another one called What Kind of Asian Are You? And it does kind of make you cringe when you realise the mistakes that we make. Sometimes Harmony Day, Looking Forward, Diversity, etc. So these are all clips that are on YouTube. All right, intervention. So we do need to intervene in the lives of young people sometimes, and this is when there is risk-taking behaviour, when they're breaking the rules, when there's any self-harm or suicidal thinking, when there's disrespect, bullying, that sort of thing, we will need to intervene. What is the purpose? The purpose is for the safety of the young person, is to change behaviours and attitudes. It's to get a positive outcome for the young person. So let's have a look at community development and looking at community. And this is a community from Tiwi Islands, boarding staff from Tiwi Islands. What is community? Community is a group of two or more people connected by a common interest, location or identity. Boarding is a community. It's part of the larger community around it. There are many communities within the boarding community. So there might be the community of basketball players. There might be the community of young people who like singing or playing guitars or whatever. So you have these different communities within your boarding residence. So What is community development? Community development are communities working together to identify their needs, plan and take action, and then evaluate that action. How did they go addressing the needs? The values of community development are social justice, self-determination, working and learning together, sustainable communities, participation, and reflective practice. And they're in section 519. So social justice is respecting and valuing diversity, addressing power imbalances, etc. Self-determination, valuing concerns that students raise, making them aware of choices, helping them set their own goals and building their own self-reliance, empowering young people, working and learning together, doing duties together, routines, contributing to the community. Sustainability is like the empowerment of all, developing skills to take action. And then also, of course, traditional sustainability, like using the resources with respect to the environment. Participation is including marginalised or excluded people, identifying barriers, breaking down barriers, and developing choice for all, sharing good practice. Reflective practice is learning by thinking back on our practice and providing opportunity for feedback, changing our practice in response. And this values a complaints process because it empowers us and keeps others informed and updated. So when we look at community development work models, there's these work models here: social action, advocacy, local development work or locality development work, brokering connections, community needs analysis, and research. And examples of those are social action is like Clean Up Australia, collecting for the Red Cross, helping at a local pet shelter, World Vision 40-hour famine. Advocacy is a student council or speaking up on behalf of a student. Locality development work, developing their own gym area or garden or guest lounge or something like that. And brokering connections is staff helping new students connect with a golf club or the football club or a part-time job or something like that. Why would we use community development in boarding? Well, for these reasons. Community development responds to the priorities of the community. It involves listening to the community, letting students set the agenda. It's an approach that creates a culture of trust and respect within clear parameters. It allows students to be more self-determining. It will result in more engaged and empowered students, and students grow in their capacity and gain the skills and experience to be more active citizens. So that's why we use a community development approach in boarding. The origins of community development. So we started out with community development with a charity type approach to meeting the needs of communities. We're focusing on communities of poverty. So the person outside the community identified the need and then provided the resources to meet the need. So a charity model might have been donations of food, money, clothing, shelter, but it did not address the underlying inequality. Communities became increasingly dependent on donations, and having an external expert always pointing out your problems is not always helpful and can be disempowering. So we had these new models come along, the evolving models of community development. So there was a needs-based model, a gaps-based model, an asset-based model, and a rights-based model. A needs-based model is where the community itself identifies the needs, and there's a respectful dialogue between the donors and the community. But this generally stopped short of addressing policies and regulations that could make systemic or long-term change. So that was a needs-based model. A gap-based model was an extension of the needs-based model. So it focused on the difference between what a system's currently doing and what it seeks to do in the future, and then it examines this gap between where you are and where you want to go. We talk often about this in Australia when we're talking about things like Aboriginal literacy, Aboriginal health, and doing something about reducing this gap between non-Aboriginal Australians and Aboriginal Australians. So the downside of a needs-based and gap-based approach are that it tends to lead to a problem-focused perspective of communities. So we're always looking at, what is the problem with this community, rather than seeing that communities have a lot to offer. So an asset-based model, this came along in the 1990s, so this focuses on the needs and issues. The community sees itself as a problem to be fixed, and it shifts the focus to examining what is strong and positive in the community. So previously, the way we looked at it is we were saying the community here is a problem and we need to fix it. Now we're saying we've got some strong and positive stuff in this community. Let's have a look at what we can do with that. So asset-based community development, and all these photos, by the way, are from Africa. So this is the Rift Valley Academy, big boarding school, a not very old boarding school in the Rift Valley. And so asset-based community development is looking within the community to find existing resources and assets. What have we already got here? What's strong and positive in the community? And then using the community's own assets and resources as a basis for development. A rights-based model is when we're saying what human rights are being neglected here, and this is more likely to explore the structural issues underlying inequality and disadvantage, and whether existing power structures need to be challenged or whether there needs to be a broader systemic change. So that's the different models for meeting the needs of communities. Okay, so let's have a look at private and public issues. So a range of issues affect students, and we need to look at these issues and try and work out how we can help or support young people. We need to recognise when an issue is private, and the exceptions, of course, are the three exceptions: mandatory reporting, if it requires mandatory reporting, if there's any danger of harm, or if you're required to report as a part of your employment. So with private to public issues, this is a fairly simple process, and it just works like this. So the student might come to you with an issue, and you might say to the student, look, this issue affects not just you, you've brought it to me, but it affects lots of other people as well. So let's take it out and see if other people want to be involved in this as well, so that we can meet a lot more people's needs. So the first part of this is eliciting or drawing out the young person's story. So we draw out their story. The second part is that we explain that it affects others. We ask permission to take it to the whole group. Could I take this to the rest of the group? And then we work with them to take it to the rest of the group. We empower them. We assist them. We don't just do it all ourselves. So we're empowering and assisting them to do it. And then at the end, of course, you would then help them reflect, give them processes for reflecting and working out if it's working. Now, the student may say, no, I don't want the others to know about that. Now, if they say that, that's okay, and you tell them that's okay, that's fine. But what we'll do is we're going to work together to make an individual action plan. And these individual action plans are on our website under the resources section if you want them. And so we make an individual action plan, and then we work with the student. We try and keep the student accountable to the action plan and monitor their progress. And that way we can help them to address their needs as well. So that's about private to public issues. All right, power imbalances. So do we have them in boarding? A power imbalance is when one person has more power than another, and that might significantly affect that second person's life. So it can come from difference in work status, age, gender, length of time in the group, all that sort of thing. And we do have a power imbalance. We, as boarding supervisors, we have a lot more power than the students that we're working with. There is a power imbalance. So how do we deal with it? First of all, we recognise that there is a power imbalance. We try and understand why there is a power imbalance. And then we act professionally and use that power appropriately. Does that make sense? Recognise the power imbalance, understand why it's there, keep our actions professional and use power appropriately. And that's the image you can see there's the Masai Mara Park in Kenya. So reflecting on practice, so reflective practice, and I often think that this is a sign of professionalism. If you are reflecting on your practice, then that is a sign that you have professional practice. So how does it work? So reflective practice, and we have talked a bit about this earlier, reflective practice is a capacity to think back on our actions or our practice, come to conclusions, and then change the practice if we need to. Think back on action, come to conclusion, change the practice as we need to. And so, for example, you might have had a incident last night where there was a couple of boys fighting, and you went in and you dealt with it. You dealt with the situation in a certain way, and after the incident, you might sit down and when you've got a quiet moment, and you might even journal this. Some people journal these reflections. Think back, think about how you did it, come to a conclusion. So you might decide, I would not do that like that next time. That didn't really work. I wouldn't do it like that. I'd do it differently. And so then you change your practice. Or you might decide, I think I did that really well, and if the same thing happened, I'd do exactly the same thing again. So that's how we reflect on our practice. All right, so we're up to question 31, getting close to the end of this. So question 31 says, actually it's not question 31, it's question 35. The numbers are a little bit out. Sorry about that. What are 3 ways you could find out if your practice in your work is being affected negatively by your own bias, background, or opinions? So how do we work that out? The first is what we've just been talking about, self-reflecting. And, when you're doing this, if you think about people's reactions to you, people's reactions to your decisions, people's reactions to your practice, and also think about, are the same issues coming up all the time? Have I always got people saying to me, look, why are you doing that? I don't understand why you're doing that. That's not a good decision. Or have you always got people saying to you, look, I don't understand what you mean. Can you explain what you mean? So when we self-reflect, we can look at people's reactions. We can think about issues that are continually occurring, and that should help us to understand how our practice is being affected by who we are. We can ask for feedback. So you might have a mentor, might be a senior house parent, or it might be a head of boarding. You can look at complaints, the complaints that are coming into boarding, and then you can just check against your code of conduct, or this might all come up in your appraisal process. Your appraisal process should help you to know if your practice is effective and if it's being affected by who you actually are. Okay, so thank you very much. That's the end of this section, BF5.